Good afternoon, everyone. In the fall of 2013, the Stephen Lewis Foundation hosted a People's Tribunal to shine a spotlight on the grandmothers who were caring for a large proportion of the over 15 million children orphaned by AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. The tribunal judges made a series of recommendations, and I'll be sharing some of those recommendations with you today. But first, I'd like to reflect for a moment on the question, why grandmothers and why grandmothers' rights? Grandmothers and the orphans that they've been caring for in sub-Saharan Africa have not been so much on the radar in the evolution of the response to the pandemic. But for us at the Stephen Lewis Foundation, the need to focus on grandmothers arose in a very simple and direct way. For more than a decade, we've been partnering with 300 grassroots community-based organizations working to turn the tide of HIV/AIDS in Africa, 15 different countries. The constant pressing issue that they brought to us was how to meet the challenge of the huge numbers of children who were orphaned by the pandemic. And what the community organizations were telling us, time and time again, in country after country, was that the only way to ensure that those children were properly cared for, or even adequately cared for, was to support the grandmothers who'd been overwhelmingly brought in and voluntarily taking responsibility for these children, despite their own desperate need and poverty. There hasn't been a great deal of policy attention to this issue, although there has been some intermittently. For example, in UNICEF's 2007 report, State of the World's Children, they noted that grandparents, and this means primarily in most cases grandmothers, were caring for 40% of all orphans in Tanzania, 45% in Uganda, 50% in Kenya, and 60% in both Namibia and Zimbabwe. The challenge is certainly overwhelming at the community level. This is the picture. Whole generations of mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles lost to the virus, as well as many of the older generation as well. The remaining grandmothers taking full responsibility, not just for 1 or 2 grandchildren or orphans, but sometimes 6 orphans, 8 orphans, 10 orphans. Government recognition and responsibility for their labors being highly uneven and in some cases pretty much non-existent. Community-based organizations straining themselves to help fill this gap, trying to provide assistance with food services, school fees, psychosocial support, income generation, home-based care. The miraculous thing in all of this is the way in which so many grandmothers are actually managing to hold their households together and enable these children to thrive despite the incredible depletion of their physical and economic, emotional resources that this work requires. And thanks in large measure to their efforts, there's new energy in rebuilding in many communities. Many are now setting their sights beyond the immediate survival needs of the children in their care and themselves to organize and mobilize and demand for some sort of change and respect for their human rights. And this was the origin of the People's Tribunal. 6 grandmothers came to Vancouver from Swaziland, Uganda, South Africa, and Kenya to testify about the violation of their rights and to issue a call for action. They spoke of the heartbreak of children leaving school because they couldn't afford the fees or the cost of uniforms and books. They spoke about what it felt like to be responsible for a household full of orphans that couldn't be fed. They spoke about the violence that their husbands and family members inflicted upon them, and when they found out about their HIV/AIDS status and their complete lack of protection from assault. They spoke about the dangers of infection posed by wife inheritance and the social ostracism, intimidation, and aggression they suffered when they were under threat of being inherited. They also spoke of an absolute epidemic of property grabbing, relatives ganging up on elderly women, taking their houses and their land once their husbands had died, and the complete indifference of local authorities and the police. They spoke about how hard it is to get treatment for HIV, compounded by all the other illnesses that are brought on by age, and about being dismissed by healthcare professionals who made it quite abundantly clear that because of their age, their lives were of very little value to the system. But despite all of this, they also spoke about the many remarkable successes they've made and in the regrouping and rebuilding they've been engaged in, not only in their own households, but in their communities. With the support of so many of the community-based organizations out there that are run by and for grandmothers, they've formed mutual support groups, counsel each other. They've been managing grief, starting small savings banks and income-generating activities. They've set up soup kitchens to feed hundreds of orphans in their communities, and many have become, although uniformly unpaid, home-based caregivers, helping to ensure thousands of people get into treatment and remain on treatment. They've joined local government, become members of local land rights committees, making sure that other grandmothers aren't deprived of their land and their property. And increasingly now they're starting to lobby for change with their governments. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. in the Global Village, we're going to be screening a film about these remarkable women that presents their testimony in their own voice and their call for action, and I would strongly encourage everyone to come to that. The tribunal judges, Theo Soa, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, Joy Famafi, and Gloria Steinem, also made extensive recommendations at the tribunal for the better protection of grandmothers' rights. There's only time to flag a couple of the recommendations, but we've brought USBs here with us with full copies of the report in case anyone wants them, and it can also be accessed on our website. I'll just flag a couple of the key recommendations here. First, greater efforts to provide pensions and cash transfers to enable grandmothers to meet their most essential needs and the needs of the children. Compensating grandmothers for their unpaid care work as community caregivers. The elimination of school fees and ancillary costs. Making local courts, policing, and legal aid more accessible and responsive. Ensuring local land administrations respect grandmothers' equal rights in the division of marital property and inheritance. Strengthening community-level mechanisms to prevent, investigate, and punish acts of violence against grandmothers. Developing community-level programs to address the challenges older women face in accessing treatment. Including grandmothers as a distinct target population in national plans to scale up and access HIV/AIDS treatment. Including grandmothers in all bodies making HIV and AIDS-related decisions, and bodies making other decisions that affect them, such as local land committees. And finally, providing greater support to the community-based organizations that are facilitating grandmothers' advocacy and organizing. I'd like to add a final note in the context of this conference, which is so concerned with the pressing matter of inclusivity, given the relative invisibility of grandmothers in the discussion to date. I think what I'll do is read from Joy Famafi's statement at the tribunal. It's the right time to be seriously reflecting on what the HIV and AIDS response really needs to achieve. HIV and AIDS is a medical emergency only in the most immediate sense. At a deeper level, it is a profound development challenge and a human rights crisis for the people and communities infected and affected by the disease. The endpoint of the response can't simply be seen as zero new infections. Our goal must be the restored health and well-being of the people who live in countries hit hardest by AIDS, and the promise of decent lives they can work together to build. From this perspective, what happens to the grandmothers in sub-Saharan Africa matters deeply. Thanks so much.